Today we will learn a little bit about adding data tests to our DBT project and configuring dynamically based on some sort of target. For example, in dev, you want this test to fail, or you want this test to pass, but in prod you want it to fail. Now, this is my DBT project setup, which is pretty straightforward. And I've got two different targets, right? So I've got dev, I've got prod. They all resolve to the same thing. The only reason why I have this here is so that we can vary up logic. For example, we want to use target name. So I have two separate targets. Okay, so let's have a look quickly what data tests are. So you can see here my full model. I've got ID is active and it's active 0. So if I build this model, we would build full that looks like this. And then I have another test, which is a singular test called assert hunky-dory. And assert hunky-dory says select star from this model where is active is not 1 or 0. So if we do tests, then it passes. Note that we can do this with accepted values, but I'm going to show what data tests are instead, right? So this is fine. Now, if we added something that violated our data tests, so perhaps state active of 2, whatever that means. Now, if we do build, which is to run the model and then to run tests, now we should see an error instead. There you go. So got one result. So how does this data test work specifically? If you have a SQL query and the SQL query return one result, at least one result, you can see down here. For example, in singular data test. So you can see here, basically, if you have a query that returns at least one record, then this is going to fail. So we can actually not even use a model and just straight away do stuff here, right? So we can copy this, and then I'm gonna kind of paste it directly in my tests. So here we're gonna select 3 rows. Obviously, this is going to fail with 3 rows. We don't even need this now. Okay. So with a query like this, with okay. Now this has written 3 rows, right? A query that looks like this has written 3 rows. Because it has written 3 rows, then our test has failed. Now if we do, for example, 0, which means if you run this in Postgres or your database, you will find that we don't return any data. Then you'll find that this is going to pass, right? Because if the query returns no rows, then the test passes. That's how a data test works. Now, there's other things we can configure about this data test. For example, config. If you look at this documentation, we have a couple of things. For example, we only want to error if there are more than a certain number of rows. So we can say error if there are more than 2 rows, right? So what this means is that if we have one result, then we get a warning, right? We don't get a failure. But as soon as we add, as soon as we breach 3 rows, then we will get into our error statement. There you go, right? So you can see here it says configure this to fail if there's more than 2. Now, what some users want to do as well is depending on the target. So for example, I can say if more than 1, if else more than 2. Okay. So with a configuration like this, what does this say? That means if the target is prod, which we see here, the target is prod, then I want it to error if there's at least one row that fit the condition. However, if I'm doing dev or something, right, I want it to be more than 2 rows. So let's see how this behaves. Oh, actually, let's make this 0, and let's make this more than 2, so 3. Okay. So the reason for this is we know that during development there will be a lot more errors. However, when I'm running in production, I want to make sure that there are no errors at all. It must be 0. Okay. So let's see what happens here. Now, if I only have one row, so which means more than 0, tests on my prop target. You can see here target prop, which is the default based on my profile, target prop. So I can do the test target prop, which is the same outcome. Error here. It should be prop. Okay. There. So we should get an error. There you go. And let's say I do dev. Then I expect no errors, but just a warning instead, because this is more than 2, right? There you go. So in dev, we get a warning instead. Now, if I exceed 3 in dev, then I'm going to get an error instead of a warning. There you go. So some users want to always pass in development mode, right? So what we can do here is, instead of specifying this, some sort of logic that fits that, we want it so that if it's in dev, we always pass. And if it's in prod, we never, well, if it's in prod, then even if we get 1, we will fail. So let's do this. I'm gonna get rid of this config. I'm gonna get rid of this config. And then what will happen now is this will fail in either dev or prod. But we can do something here and say target name dev. And we can do a limit 0, right? So what happens here? Now, this means that if it is my dev, then the query return is always limit 0. So no matter how many data rows that violate the problem, but it's 1, 2, or 3, or 10, or a million, this will always be returning no rows. And if it returns no rows, then this will always pass, right? But when we're running in production, this will evaluate to not be added to a query, in which case you get an error, and even a single one will throw the error in our production. There you go. And only the case where there is no data, that production will pass, because there is no data that kind of violates the condition, and that's fine. Okay. Now, instead of doing this here, where I put the limit directly into the query itself, what we can also do is, if you look here, there's a configuration called limit as well for data test limit. So if we do that, we can do this, for example, 0 if target name else and return some sort of value here, maybe return only 500. So if we do target prod, this is going to fail because the limit is going to be added at the bottom here. And we do it in dev, then it should return no rows. So even if this didn't change, then it should pass. There you go. But I probably don't recommend it this way, because the logic here is that we will always add this limit. If you add a config limit, we will always add this. So you need to set this value to be some sort of higher number, or at least 1. So kind of up to you. So my recommendation is probably not do it here, but do it how it was before, where I had it in the test itself, right? So in this way, we don't have to apply a limit for prod. We'd only apply this limit 0 for development, because in development, we don't really care whether there are problems with the data. Thank you.